And welcome to Off the Couch, where psychology meets everyday life. I'm Dr. Greg Cason, psychologist, and I'm here to talk about several stories with producer Brian Gomez. Say hey, Brian.
Happy Monday, you guys.
And also on the board is DJ Sammy G.
That's right.
Hey. So today on Off the Couch, we're going to ask the question, are college students losing it? You can weigh in on that, DJ Sammy G. And the 5 basic habits proven to improve your mental health and make things worse if you skip them. And in the news, we're going to talk about the top 10 psychological reasons that people still want Donald Trump. But first, we're going to talk about a brand new president for Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum is the first female president of Mexico. She is a climate scientist, Mexico City's former mayor. She won the country's largest election in history. She's known as La Doctora because she has a PhD in energy engineering, and she was part of the United Nations panel of climate scientists that received a Nobel Peace Prize. She was extremely esteemed, but she's also set to be Mexico's first female president. And she's also the country's first Jewish leader, even though she governs as a secular leftist. And she actually promised to govern all Mexicans, quote, without distinction. And I thought that was very interesting. And we're going to be talking about that when we talk about leadership later. That, to me, stood out as a really good sign. How do you feel about this, Brian?
Oh, I think it's cool. I think especially for the women in Mexico, it's going to be a big voice for them in the sense with like the femicide that's been going on for years. I think it's great, at least even for moral, uplifting.
It is.
I think it's a cool thing. I mean, everywhere in the world, I think this is showing, a cool stance on it.
It really is. I was really excited because there are a lot of great things, but I thought, why is he bringing this up on a psychology podcast? Well, the reason is because this reflects something in a dynamic that we often don't think about, and that's the importance of leaders. And there's something called social learning theory. This is a learning theory that's in the world of psychology, pioneered by Albert Bandura. And he proposed that there are key principles of social learning theory that suggest through observational learning, children model their behaviors by watching others. That is basically the individuals develop through environmental factors, namely imitation of role models. So by all the children in Mexico, and even by virtue of other children around the world and other people around the world, seeing a female leader of a major country such as Mexico, who was the mayor of the world's largest city, which was Mexico City, and now she's the president of Mexico. They're going to be now seeing that leadership is a part of their future if they want it. And I think this is an incredibly powerful model. And our country hasn't even had a female president or a Jewish president. So it's really kind of an interesting thing that's happening there in Mexico. But when we look at the power of leaders, and when we watch leaders and leaders lead with distinction, it creates powerful role models for children. So I thought that was kind of a nice thing.
Yeah, it'll definitely be a good influence on the rest of the world, where maybe we also might have a female president at some point.
Maybe. We got close, but close, but no cigar. Okay, this week in psychology, America's college students seem to be more stressed than ever. Here are some of the issues: campus shootings, sexual assaults, physical violence, natural disasters, racial trauma, like the George Floyd protest, and now encampments and rhetoric that's dividing students rather than uniting them. So that led to concerns about trauma. Now, the presence or history of such events that we just talked about can trigger trauma reactions. And trauma reactions are kind of characterized in a specific way in the world of psychology. And a lot of people don't think of trauma reactions, that they're actually an anxiety reaction. And so let's talk about the different types of trauma reactions. There's chronic re-experiencing, which is flashbacks and nightmares. There's avoidance, which things that remind you of the trauma. There's arousal, which is hypervigilance. It's going toward the trauma. And then there are mood and cognition changes like feeling detached, anhedonia, and intense guilt. And there are two types of trauma that we look at, of the very severe trauma reactions. There's something called acute stress disorder and PTSD. All we ever hear about is PTSD. Everyone talks about trauma like they just drop it. Oh my God, I was so traumatized last night. That probably wasn't a trauma. I was traumatized. They didn't have our table ready for half an hour. That's not a trauma. But yet people use that word a lot. A real trauma is something that genuinely affects your life in a negative way, in such that generally you have your life threatened, or you observe someone else's life or welfare being threatened, or you have some other event that has such a profound impact, a negative impact on your life, that it might lead to a change in mind and change in living experience and understanding of the world. Acute stress disorder, just to let you know, it's less than 30 days long. So, that's a pretty normal reaction. Almost anyone who goes through a big trauma experience might have some of these issues. But most of them abate or go away by the end of 30 days. But if they last longer than 30 days and you have these different things we just talked about, that could lead or indicate PTSD. So this led the University of Alabama at Birmingham. They decided to find out, how are these things affecting students? Is trauma still a reaction? So they decided to look at the Healthy Minds data set. And I just want to point out, I brought my big red Solo cup because we're talking about college students, just to kind of blend in here, which with the Healthy Minds data set tracks mental health. Over 392,000 college students are tracked. They attend 332 colleges and universities across the United States. And in this data set, 58% of them are female. And they published the findings of this. They wanted to see who has PTSD, who has acute stress disorder. The following was published in JAMA Network Open and found the following. Nearly 5%, or 1 in 20 students, were diagnosed with PTSD during the study period. That was between 2017 and 2022. Doesn't that surprise you guys? 1 in 20 have PTSD? That's a very serious disorder.
Well, we have a lot going on in the world. I feel like it makes sense, honestly. Sadly,
it seemed high. And then 0.5%, or just about 0.5%, have acute stress disorder. And why there's the lower diagnosis there is maybe due to that it only lasts for 30 days. So you only stay in that particular diagnosis for 30 days or less, and you may not move to PTSD. And I guess a lot of people move to PTSD and have stayed there for a while. That's my only guess about why there's this disparity. But the averages, there are averages. These are averages that I just talked about. But what was the universal event that happened from 2020 to 2022 that may have had a traumatic impact on students?
The pandemic.
The pandemic. So that really did seem to account. And when we look at these graphs, the 2020 and 2022, you can see the numbers just absolutely jump in both traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder. So when you look over time, you see from the beginning to the end, scores more than double in both PTSD and acute stress disorder. In fact, PTSD in the 2022 year was 7.5%. And in the 2022 year for acute stress disorder, it was 0.7%. So it was more than doubled for both. I mean, that was crazy.
And then is this happening from like actual personal individual incidents, or is it because of everything that's happening in the world and like how we're seeing it more?
Well, that's a great question, actually, because there is, number one, it's the event. Number two, it's how we perceive the event. And number three, how we feel like, do we believe someone has our back? Do we feel supported? And there's another concept called self-efficacy, and another concept that's directly tied to PTSD or to trauma reaction, which is called resilience or resiliency. And so resilience is really your ability to handle problems. And the interesting thing about PTSD or about trauma reactions, you can put a bunch of people through a trauma reaction and most people will get better on their own. I think that's pretty cool.
No, that is cool.
But some people might have lingering effects. That could be because of how they experienced the trauma, how they perceived it, what their coping skills were beforehand, what other types of things they might have had going on, other disorders, etc. I don't want to get too far into it, but bottom line is there are a lot of risk factors that can make someone's reaction to trauma worse.
Cool. So, thanks for explaining that.
So what can we do? We can make mental health services accessible and available, but I hate this. Mental health services cannot solve this issue. So mental health services can be there to help. Mental health services can do things to educate and try to prevent, and they can do things to treat, but they can't necessarily cause a trauma not to happen. They can, but PTSD, people who have PTSD need a few things. So one thing a college can do, or any organization, is to create a safe, supportive, and stable environment. And people who experience trauma often feel powerless. So in college, people could design courses and experiences and environments to help students feel in control and be able to affect change. Listen without advice or shoulds. Just listen to people and give them tools to weather adversity. I think I just addressed that, rather than either denying their adversity, thus invalidating their experience. That'll actually make it worse. When you say, oh, that shouldn't affect you. That's not a thing. Stop being a big baby. That doesn't really help people get over trauma. Also, rescuing them is equally bad. Rescuing them creates more of a sense that they're powerless. So, scooping in there and I'm going to take you out of here. And unless it's a truly bad place, helping them to weather the problems is going to generally be the best thing. Unless it is, again, like a very traumatic environment, like a war zone. It would be good to get out of there.
And then also, I don't know if like everybody knows like what trauma is, or like I feel like a lot of people aren't really aware of like certain things that could be identified as trauma in that sense.
Well, generally with PTSD, and originally it was we called this battle fatigue. It's an old term, and it was primarily related to what they experience on the battlefield, and that we came to understand PTSD as this lingering effects of surviving, watching people die, or constantly being under the threat of dying. So those tremendously difficult things, or being maimed, or losing limbs, etc., it's not a small thing by any means. It also has been expanded to people who've been sexually assaulted and raped, people who've been robbed at gunpoint, have their lives threatened, people who might live in an environment or have a car crash. Sometimes a car crash can bring on a PTSD, or I had clients who, when their house burned down, that caused a PTSD reaction. So this is, there are different things that happen that can actually trigger trauma. What we want to be careful of, and I think it's just an overused word, is using the word trauma for things that really aren't traumatic. It cheapens it for the people who really have that issue. That's all.
Cool. Thank you.
So let's talk about the 5 basic habits to improve your mental health. This is another college mental health thing. And I guess this was, in a way, this was a college theme, but there's a basic push by college mental health services for prevention. And this Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, wanted to figure out ways for people to with mild to moderate anxiety and depression, what they can do for their mental health. So you're in college, aren't you, DJ?
I am.
And what do you do to help prevent anxiety and depression?
I try and give myself time during the week that's just for myself.
Okay.
I personally do have a panic disorder that I developed in college. So I use the skills that I've learned of just kind of taking a deep breath and making sure that I'm okay before I do anything else for others in the situation, if that
Excellent.
Makes sense.
Oh, I love that. You use the model that we teach people from the airplane, which is to place a mask upon yourself before helping anyone else, before assisting another passenger, excuse me. I actually think that's a great model, and that when you do have something, it is good to attend to yourself so that you can be there for other people. So good for you. That's pretty right on. Well, you're going to have to check with me because I thought this study was very compelling. It was done with college students, but then it was expanded out. There's a psychologist at Macquarie University. He decided to focus on what's called the 5 activities that are strongly linked to good mental health. You know, when we're in college, we don't often do things to actually help ourselves. We become so immersed in the work and the parties, and then the parties, and then I don't know what else. Work.
School.
Doing a lot of work. Yeah, and jobs. I had to work always jobs, and that was pretty much my life. I worked weird jobs and sat in a basement and tried to read. Okay, so he focused on these big 5 thinkings that have been linked to improve your mental health. Realistic thinking, meaningful activities, having goals and plans, healthy habits, and social connections. And I'll go over those later if anyone's listening. I'm going to explain the study and then go over them one more time. So those 5 things are strongly related to symptoms of depression, anxiety, and satisfaction of life. And that's based on a wide community sample of 6,200 adults. Previous studies with the big 5 of these things found that at least if you do these things half the days of the week, so basically 4 days a week, 3.5, 4 days a week, it's strongly associated with positive mental health. And it significantly lowers depression and anxiety symptoms. And this has been repeated in Canada and Australia, and with over 20,000 people. Why? I'll say this about Canada, I'll say this about the United Kingdom and Australia. They have these large data sets that are just incredible because they have these large public health care systems, and it's why they can really get the jump on us in some of these really meaningful, giant studies that can give us great information. But it's nice in the research world, we can benefit from their findings. So although we may not be able to do it ourselves, we can certainly benefit from it. This study assesses if restricting the big 5 actions of depression and anxiety, they basically look at, did these work? These have been proven to work. Then we're going to take it into a college and we're going to see, are these people, does it work? And they're going to see, what if we take away some of the things and see if it still works? They basically were trying to see, are people going to be okay? Will they develop depression and anxiety? So they found 26 mentally well people. I mean, only 26, but they found 26 mentally well people with no depression, no anxiety, and no mental health medications. And they asked them to systematically reduce their big 5 activities under supervision and then resume again. And then they measured the impact of those measures of those actions on depression and anxiety. They published this in Behavior Research and Therapy. Oh my God. Well, what do you think? Did it impact them?
I'm sure it messed them up a bit.
Well, they did like weekly self-assessments of depression and anxiety. They did logs, how many times they did their big 5 activities. They had texting to tell them when to do it. It was very involved, so it was a very intensive study. But after just 2 weeks, 1 in 3 participants remained in the healthy range of depression. After 2 weeks, 2/3 had moved into a depressive state. I mean, this is wild. 40% progressed to mild depression, and 25% progressed to moderate depression, where it interfered with their daily activities.
Damn, that was quick too.
It was really fast. The researchers were expecting only a slight reduction in well-being. They were just trying to see, does this have an effect? They didn't know that it would be this strong, and they even said in their study this was much stronger than they expected. People who restricted their big 5 activities by at least 25% saw a significant drop in your well-being. And nobody, which was also interesting, nobody said the word depression, even though when you gave them the depression test, the assessments, they came up in depression, but they used words like, I'm struggling. And have you ever felt like that? Like you just feel like every day is a slog and it's difficult and it's harder than usual?
I call it the fog.
The fog.
Where it's sometimes really hard you can't see clearly, it's something clouding your mind or vision in a way.
Ooh, I like that. They also had a recovery phase because they're like, oh, we gave these people depression. What do we do? So they had them return to their usual big 5 activities, and they saw improvements right away. So what they kind of uncovered here was the necessity of keeping up these activities every week. So after 5 weeks, most of the participants were back to the healthy range of depression symptoms, and only one remained in the mild range. So that was good. But it took them a few weeks. So reports from participants. I thought this was really interesting. One person said their entire routine had been thrown out. Some people noticed they felt tired in the afternoon and end up taking a nap. Isn't that interesting? Resulting in trouble sleeping at night, resulting in sleeping in the next morning. So it completely threw off their sleep schedule. Also, the more they restricted their big 5 activities, the longer it took for them to recover. And people reported that recovery was harder than expected. One person said he lost his mental fitness and needed to give himself a talking to get back to his usual routines, habits, and lifestyle. That's like self-coaching. So the analogy the researchers made, which I think is a good one, I've made this myself, is the analogy between mental fitness, mental fitness and physical fitness. Both take time to build up, and if you don't maintain certain activities for whatever reason, you lose that fitness. So we need to really take these things seriously to keep our lives in a healthy range. And we need to learn that when we have things like depression and anxiety, it's good for us to pay attention. Something's going on. But if you lose your fitness, it's going to take you longer to recover. So let's go back over the big 5. Realistic thinking. Number 1, think realistically about ourselves, the world, and the future. This is an essential part of cognitive psychology. We don't teach positive thinking. We don't have you look in the mirror and tell me, I'm wonderful. We have you do realistic thinking, which is to assess things for what they truly are. Then we also engage in meaningful activities. Well, we talked about this when we talked about behavioral activation in college students. There's a lot of college student study going on. Meaningful activities, sense of accomplishment, satisfaction, and joy, like things that bring you meaning. Sometimes it's your major. Maybe for our DJ Sammy G, maybe it's working the board here at the show. That certainly means something to us. Thank you. It could be also goals and plans. Keeping your goals and plans going, setting and working toward and accomplishing goals. Healthy habits like cooking and eating a regular meal. This is where I fall down. Having a regular bedtime and getting regular exercise. and which I think is probably one of the most important, which is social connections, connecting with family and friends. Okay. And now brings us to the big one. Our former president, guilty of 34 counts for election interference. He is the first former president to be found guilty of felony in a court of law. The indictment brought by a grand jury of 23 New Yorkers and guilty conviction by a jury of 12 New Yorkers. And this brings in the United States in line with other Western democracies who hold their leaders, such as France, Italy, Israel, who hold their leaders to account. What are you guys thinking about this? Did you have any reactions to this? No?
I mean, I was like, oh, cool. They got it on paper, but, you know, what? I mean, he's still running, so I think that's kind of weird that you can do anything like that and still run the country. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just odd. I'm like, wow, and they're letting anybody do this at this point.
Yeah, I'm like, all right, great, but like, nothing is gonna
what
happen.
happens? You know, he's still running, so that's weird.
Well, I didn't think he wouldn't run, but so if you do my parents always said, if you do the crime, you have to do the time. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. I remember them saying that to me over and over when I was a kid. Oddly enough, they're Trump supporters now. So, but I mean, you know, we don't talk about that type of thing, but I am very curious about this. So the ABC News Ipsos poll, they polled 781 adults on May 31st and June 1st. So that was right after the verdict. The verdict was announced on May 30th in the afternoon. So they went the next 2 days, and they polled 781 Americans. And they discovered... They asked, was this verdict correct? 50% said it is correct. DJ, can you put up that blue one? I think it is. The ABC Ipsos poll. That's it. 50% said the verdict is correct. 27% said it's not correct. And 23% said they don't know if the verdict is correct or not. Now, I gave it to the 23% because if you're not following the trial, then you can't really make much of an assessment. If you followed the trial closely, then you were probably able to see, I think it had like 22 witnesses. It went over, I don't know how many weeks, 9 weeks. I don't know. Like it went a long time at like 22 witnesses. I mean, it was a pretty involved, very intricate trial, and both sides, the prosecution and it was like the American justice system at work. And this is what the jury came back with. So the 23 said they don't know if the verdict is correct or not. I thought that was that was fair. 50% believing it's correct. Well, I hope they did follow the trial. But the 27% said it's not correct. I was really curious about those people. And then I went to the CBS YouGov poll. The CBS YouGov poll even made me more curious. Is Trump fit to be president now that he's convicted? And a whopping 40% said yes. 40%. So I'm like, from a psychological point of view, who thinks that this is fair? So let me ask, what are the psychological mechanisms at work that help create this robust support base that remains loyal to Trump? So I looked at that and looked at 10 possible reasons. So let's go through these and you guys tell me if this makes sense to you. Number one, it's something called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is a concept in psychology. People tend to favor information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs and disregard information that contradicts them. So if they already had positive beliefs and belief that former President Trump could not do such a thing, they wouldn't be swayed by a guilty verdict in a trial.
No, it'd be like being part of a cult.
It could be. Well, I'm not assessing whether they are or not with that particular thing. I'm just, saying yes. They could be in a cult.
But in a cult, that's how it
would
play
actually.
out.
Yes, you're correct. Trump's supporters may interpret the guilty verdict as biased or unjust and reinforce their existing support. So they're like, "Oh, he's being treated unfairly. This just proves that he's as good as he is." So that's kind of like how confirmation bias works. It has us only filter in information that we deem acceptable, and we filter out information that we don't want to hear.
That seems to be a big thing in America, I feel like.
It's a big thing everywhere. Confirmation bias is kind of one of the, if you got to know a psychological concept, that's a good one to know.
Well, especially I think with social media, like you seek out what you want, and then the algorithm knows what you want, so then it'll just show you that.
It'll filter it out for you.
Yeah.
This is why I'm not a fan of social media for that many reasons. That, and I just can't see any more abs. But
It's summertime.
No, but the bottom line is, yes, that's exactly right. They do that for you, and then you end up getting in this warped world, which, DJ, you are really ahead of the game, because we're going to come to that one. But number 2 is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is another good psychological term to know about. Cognitive dissonance, I'm going to read this for you. When confronted with information that conflicts about their beliefs, individuals experience cognitive dissonance. So if you have these two psychological concepts, like and you walk that person who always walks old ladies across the street, you think he's really great, but then you find out the 100th old lady, he stole her purse. Like, you have to put this together. Who is this person? So you got these two conflicting ideas. And that's kind of a rough idea, but basically we have two conflicting ideas, and we have to, when we have cognitive dissonance, we have to resolve it in a particular direction. So to reduce the discomfort, the psychological discomfort we're having here, Trump supporters might rationalize the verdict as politically motivated or dismiss it as part of a larger conspiracy.
Instead of understanding it.
Possibly, yes. So it might be that, they rationalize it that way, and then that way it kind of reduces the psychological stress.
So it's easier.
For
them, we all believe that.
We all do this when we have conflicting ideas. And one thing I am really grateful for, having gone through grad school, is they force you to have to sit with competing ideas. And even this morning, I was talking to someone who attended a lecture with someone who clerked for a previous Supreme Court justice, and she said that the person who clerked said this particular person, which was Sandra Day O'Connor, she was the first female Supreme Court justice. We're going to do the first female. That'll be our other theme today besides college students. But she was the first female Supreme Court justice, and she apparently would hire a liberal clerk and a conservative clerk, and when she had to figure out things, she would have them sort of duke it out, or work with each other to get some kind of opinion where they uncovered and listened to each other and came to a more of a consensus opinion. I thought that was pretty profound, when we've got to be able to hold all sorts of information. When we only go to one point of view, it actually limits us. So that was number 2, is cognitive dissonance. Number 3 is identity, and group loyalty. For many supporters, Trump is more than a political figure. He represents their cultural identity and values. And group loyalty and social identity theory explain why people stick with their in-group, which here is Trump supporters despite negative information. So when we feel this group loyalty, we feel a part of this group, and that's very powerful. I mean, are there certain groups you feel part of, and you're like, you give them a lot of grace, the group, and you want to be a part of that group, and then also you don't want to be rejected by the group. And what the group does, that's called our reference group, we often follow along. And we learn from the group. So group identity and social identity can be extremely powerful.
That makes sense, especially with like smaller towns that are like a lot more conservative, that you're kind of like standing out as like the sore thumb in a big wave of like, you know, people thinking a certain way. So it's like you better follow along with that way of thinking.
I am always interested in like a small town with the person who has the one unusual opinion. In fact, in every organization, you always want people who have conflicting opinions, because otherwise you get into this concept, another psychological concept called groupthink. And in groupthink, everyone thinks the same way, and it reduces creativity. So we don't want groupthink, and that's why like with Sandra Day O'Connor, at least there, she resolved that by having people with conflicting ideas. And we see that, I think it was Lincoln who had his team of rivals. He had people that would be in his cabinet who didn't agree with each other because they could help come up with the best solutions.
And do you think or feel like groupthink is happening currently?
Yes.
Okay. I just didn't.
Of course there are. Yeah. I think that's part of the problem. So supporting Trump has become an expression of loyalty for the group identity. Number 4 is moral disengagement. Supporters might morally disengage from Trump's actions by minimizing the seriousness of the charges, comparing them to the worst actions of others, or displacing responsibility. So this is basically, it allows them to maintain their support even though they believe the negative actions are taken, without feeling guilty or conflicted, because they rationalize it by saying, well, other people do it. So this is an old Russian tactic. I don't know if you guys know about this, called whataboutism. And this tactic is basically where you just point at everybody else. Say, what about him? What about him? What about him? And then the more alternative possibilities we introduce, the more watered down our original concern is. What's so powerful about this is I use this positively with people who might get locked on an idea that might be damaging to them. Like an idea that might be damaging, it's like, when I go to work, I'm going to be fired because my boss called me and said he needed to talk to me before work started. And you're like, well, that is one possibility. But what else might be a possibility? And what else might be a possibility? And, can we help reduce the anxiety by having some other things that you can hold true? And it will water down the anxiety around that particular fear. Like maybe he just wants you to get in early because he wants to give you a special role in the meeting, or wants to give you a certain project or task, or didn't like the way you performed on something and wanted to give you feedback. There could be many reasons for that.
That's a cool way to think about it, for sure.
But unfortunately, whataboutism is used here for negative, where we look at other people, and I hear it all the time. People are like, it's very interesting. There's another trial. The other president, President Biden, is having his son on trial. People are like, what about that? What about that? So, yeah, that doesn't take away from the other thing. So we have to be very careful about the whataboutism here. Number 5, this is actually very important, which is called charismatic leadership. And Trump's charismatic leadership style influences confidence in people, assertiveness, his includes confidence, assertiveness, and a strong persona. This can lead followers to place trust in him and view his actions more leniently. So charismatic leadership actually has people kind of give up some of their own critical thinking because they want to follow the charismatic leader. Charismatic leaders often inspire loyalty and devotion and can transcend legal or ethical violation.
Sounds about right.
But do we want a charismatic leader? This was what was so interesting to me about Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, because she said she wanted to govern Mexico without distinction. She wants to get in there and do the work. Is that good? or should she be a charismatic, inspirational leader for Mexico? Should she be Evita Peron? Was Evita Peron good for Argentina?
No.
She made a good musical. So I watched this TED Talk on good leadership called Good Leadership Looks Boring. And I'm like, wow, I have to watch that. And this historian actually talks about something called the action fallacy. It's our mistaken belief that the best leaders are the best leaders because they generate the most noise, the most action, and the most sensational activities in the most dramatic circumstances. This is the action fallacy. And he said that people confuse a good story with good leadership.
Oh, yeah.
And there it is with Eva Peron, you know. I mean, she wasn't really and Juan Peron. But she, it's a good story, but it was a good leadership. And good leadership, he advocated, and he had lots of examples of this and had written 2 books on particular leaders. He was a leadership expert. Good leadership results in a boring story. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So maybe we don't necessarily want charismatic leadership.
I mean, I'm cool with having a peaceful, life.
Yeah.
I don't need the excitement.
Boring leaders are the best leaders. They get the most done. And what's interesting is we did have a charismatic leader in Barack Obama. He was quite charismatic. And he was a good storyteller, etc. But Barack Obama did a lot to subvert that and to, be a worker and be more of a workhorse, which I think was a very smart move for him. Instead of sticking his neck out and constantly, basically he's like, okay, it got me in, now I'm going to do the work. Which
that's
was
what you would expect.
That's what you would hope. Yeah. Okay, number 6 is perceived persecution. Trump has consistently framed himself as a victim of a witch hunt by the media and political opponents. This narrative can resonate with supporters who feel similarly marginalized and distrustful of institutions, reinforcing their support for him as someone who is fighting a common enemy. And I think this is a big one. This is actually, when we look at the deaths of despair, which there's being people pushing back on that concept, but I think it's a solid one, that there are groups of people out there who are living on the margins, who've had a lot of adversity in their lives, and who die of these behavioral means, because they become alcoholic or opioid addicts or overweight and other things. They live unhealthy lives, and then they end up dying earlier than other people and even commit suicide. So these kinds of deaths of despair can often, these people, before they get to that point, of course, they feel marginalized and distrustful, and they feel like they're kind of out there. And here in Donald Trump, that they have someone who is kind of their person. As a client put it to me once, he said, and I thought this was quite brilliant, he said, he's not just a bully, he's their bully. He's their bully who's out there fighting for them as a bully. I mean, maybe that's what he's doing. So they feel like he has their back.
I'm wondering what he's fighting.
Them. Them.
Human rights?
I think one of his longtime workers, Barbara Rez, she wrote a book, very interesting. And, I'm always interested in people's personalities, and maybe this is a little too much. But Barbara Rez said, it's been consistent since day one. He always felt other people had it out to get him. So that's consistent from day one. So he kind of comes from that place, and
that's the mentality.
That's the mentality, and he's going to filter in that information. So that's going to be his confirmation bias.
It almost seems like a reality TV show with him.
Well, he was in one.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I feel like that's how he's playing it all out.
In fact, I'm going to talk about that reality. Thank you, Brian. Media influence and echo chambers. Supporters often consume, this is number 7, supporters often consume media that aligns with their beliefs, creating echo chambers where they're exposed primarily to information that supports Trump. Things like Fox TV or Newsmax, or I can't follow all of them. Whatever the one, the Twitter thing.
Oh, X.
What's it called? Yeah, X has certainly gone more that way, but also he has his own Twitter.
Oh, their own platform.
Yeah, I
Right.
can't remember
don't
what
know
it's
it
called.
is.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sure someone will correct me. But basically,
We don't need to know.
selective. Well, I think it's important. But nonetheless, if you're on there, you're probably going to only get positive information about him. So selective exposure reinforces their views and shields them from dissenting perspectives. But what you were just saying, Brian, I also put in this. This may have started from something called halo effect, another psychological principle. I always teach this when I'm teaching like college students. I'm like, halo effect. Let's talk about this. Halo effect, when you have a first impression, it's lasting. So you develop a positive halo or a negative halo. So when you're meeting a college student or you're going to a job, you want to develop that positive halo up front. But a lot of people's first exposure to Donald Trump was through The Apprentice TV show. That was his reality show he was on. And I never saw it, but I heard he was very good in the show, and a lot of people really enjoyed the show. So that past exposure gave them what we call a positive halo toward him, and it gave people the benefit. They gave him the benefit of the doubt because they saw him as a charismatic businessman, and they saw him as very competent, and so they filter in information thinking that was reality. But that was a TV show.
He knows how to get the ratings, and I feel like that's how he's playing it out.
I mean, he's a PR master. I will say, a PR master.
Even if it's a straight up lie, I feel like they're still so on it that you are like, oh, they're right.
I'm sorry I didn't realize about time. We're going to go through these next ones as quickly as we can. Number 8, authority and trust in leadership. Some individuals have high trust in authority and established leaders. If they perceive Trump as legitimate and authoritative, they may be more inclined to trust his denials and explanations over the court's verdict. Again, remember that action fallacy, giving credence to a leader who generates the most noise. Also, nostalgia. Number 9, nostalgia and reluctance to change. Trump's messaging often includes themes of restoring past greatness, challenging the status quo, and appealing to those who feel disenchanted with the current political and social dynamics. This emotional appeal can overshadow legal issues. This could also represent something called the sunk cost fallacy. We have a lot of concepts at work here. The sunk cost fallacy is a phenomenon whereby a person is reluctant to abandon a strategy or course of action because they're so invested in it. So sunk costs can relate to financial investments, can relate to psychological, emotional, time investments. Like we get involved in some, can be a marriage, that you stay in something even though it's clear that abandonment would be more beneficial, like leaving it would be more beneficial. So sometimes it assists us, it helps us get through rough times, like in a marriage, and sometimes it really hurts us, like maybe if we're staying with an investment that just continually goes down. And number 10 is fear of change. Fear of political and social changes could have helped with the shift in leadership that can drive continued support for Trump. His supporters keep being told and might fear that the alternative would be worse. We always hear that, even though the alternative is literally in the office at this moment, leading them to cling to their preferred leader despite legal troubles. These psychological mechanisms that we just discussed combine to create a robust support of the support base that remains loyal to Trump, interpreting negative events in ways that might reinforce their commitment to him. So let me go through those one more time. Confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, identity and group loyalty, moral engagement, charismatic leadership, perceived persecution, media influence and echo chambers, authority and trust in leadership, nostalgia and reluctance to change, and fear of change. So there we have it, folks. Those are the 10 reasons why maybe people don't really care about that verdict and actually are just digging their heels in deeper. Some folks, at least.
Well, I hope the U.S. changes that at some point, and we don't have to go all about that.
Well, I think, we'll just have to see how things go in November. That's the big election, and, I hope everything goes the way that is most beneficial to this country.
To the people,
To the people. That's right. Well, thank you, DJ Sammy G and Brian. That wraps up the show for today. I want to remind you to like, subscribe, give us 5 stars. Links to the studies that we talk about, go to my YouTube page at youtube.com/Dr. Greg, including that. I have a link to that leadership video that I think is really great. Also, if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, hit me up on the socials at Ask Dr. Greg. Should have thought about that when I got it. And this is Dr. Greg, Brian, and DJ Sammy G. Until next time, be present, be flexible, and be kind.